Hello, everyone. Welcome to Global Fact 7. My name is Tom Jones. I'm the senior media writer at the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. I write our daily newsletter, the Poynter Report, which brings you the latest media news and analysis. And I'm very honored to be the moderator today for a very special panel as we look at fact-checking at this really unique time in our history. And so welcome to Too Much to Handle, fact-checking during a pandemic and presidential election campaign. As I mentioned, this is a very chaotic time in our history as we're dealing with a once-in-a-100-year pandemic. And at the same time, the United States is going through protests about racial inequality following the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minnesota. And all this is happening as we geared up for what we already anticipated was going to be a very contentious and divisive presidential election, even made more so now by the events of the past few months. And now, more than ever, media, journalism, and facts are as important as they've ever been. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. You're going to have a chance to talk and ask questions of our guest panel here today. But first, I wanted to introduce our panel one at a time, talk to them for just a few moments, just to get a sense of who they are and introduce you to what we're going to be talking about today. So first up, I'd like to welcome in Angie Drobnic, Holan, editor-in-chief of the Pulitzer Prize-winning PolitiFact. Angie, thanks so much for joining us. You and I are longtime colleagues at the Tampa Bay Times for many years. Take us back, if you would, as a real quick refresher, to what it was like when you guys started PolitiFact. Did you ever envision it would turn into what it is today?
You know, I've been thinking a lot about that today. We started PolitiFact back in 2007 in the Tampa Bay Times newspaper. I was a news researcher at the time. I'd had reporting experience and a degree in journalism, and I was working on another degree in library science because I was thinking about getting out of journalism. But then I connected with Bill Adair in the newsroom, and this project just seemed a really good crossroads and so forward thinking. And I started as a reporter on the website. I was covering healthcare. I fact-checked the drafting of the Affordable Care Act, which was quite an adventure. And today I'm editor-in-chief, and it's just been new challenges, new interests. Every time I think I've seen it all, something new comes along. And you know, that can be good too, because it captures my attention and my engagement. So I've been editor-in-chief now since 2013, and it's been a great journey.
Was this the vision, Angie, when you guys started this? Did you envision this is where it would be in 2020, or did you really have no idea of where this was going to evolve into?
You know, I remember Bill Adair telling me, and the other reporter at the time was Rob Farley, who's now at factcheck.org. And he told us, like, you're going to be able to build your careers around fact checking. And we kind of rolled our eyes and we're like, yeah, Bill. So he has proved correct. Ding, ding, ding. Good for you, Bill. It looks different than we thought it was. There's a lot of things we didn't envision. Like, we started off with partnerships with a lot of US newspapers. And those have been very fruitful and wonderful partnerships. But US newspapers are in a lot of trouble. So we don't have the number of partnerships that we used to. And when we started, I have to say, Twitter and Facebook were not really a thing. They barely existed. And this idea that there would be these giant platforms and the misinformation problems that I think we're all working together to address, like, that wasn't even on the horizon. So a lot of things have changed and things that we never anticipated.
The last 3 months working from home, quarantine, has it impacted your job in any way?
It's impacted I think it's more impacted our personal lives. Like I said, PolitiFact has always had partnerships. So we've been used to working remotely. We had a lot of tech tools to help us work collaboratively. So when we all started staying home, it was pretty seamless. We didn't struggle to figure out how to work with each other. But I think psychologically, it's been really tough not being in the office, not seeing colleagues, the anxiety, that we have for our loved ones and for our coworkers, I think is a real thing. So I wouldn't say it's been easy, but the work has gone on much as it did before.
Right. I think it's one of those rare stories that journalists are actually living it as well as reporting on it. I mean, it's something that we're all going through. So I'm sure
Yeah.
that's impacted you. So it's so good to see you, Angie. I'm looking forward to talking to you more. Next up, I'd like to welcome in from the Washington Post, editor and chief writer for the Washington Post fact checker, Glenn Kessler. Glenn took over his role with fact checker in 2011 after a long and distinguished career as a reporter both at the Post and at Newsday, where he won a couple of Pulitzer Prizes, or part of a team that won a couple of Pulitzer Prizes. And also the Post fact checker team has published a book this month, Donald Trump and His Assault on the Truth. Glenn, welcome in. First, let me ask you about the book right out of the gate here. How's it doing? When I say how's it doing, I mean in terms of what's been the reaction to it.
The reaction has been great. We got a starred review from Kirkus, which called it a valuable chronicle. We were on the national bestseller list that Publishers Weekly puts out. Susan Glasser in the New Yorker called it a public service of a book. I mean, it's been, we've gotten a great response, and it's designed to help Americans and other people around the globe just understand the full range of falsehoods and misleading things the president has said.
What's been the reaction from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
Well, frankly, I was hoping for like a nasty tweet or something. He would boost book sales. We haven't heard anything from either 1600 Pennsylvania or the Trump campaign. It's derived from our database of fact checks of President Trump. We chronicle every single false or misleading statement he makes. We are about to hit 20,000. It's an extremely time-consuming job for me and my team. So they are aware of the things that we've been saying and chronicling, and they've never complained about it. So I guess they knew what to expect.
Glenn, you're talking, I mean, that's a number that almost doesn't seem real, 20,000 numbers. And then we're talking about 3 years. You could probably write a book about this every week. How do you wrap your brain around it? I mean, how do you determine, okay, these are the lies or misleading statements that we need to highlight, and the other ones that we're just going to let that one go by and not swing at it?
Well, the reason we started this, sorry, I'm having trouble with my thing here. The reason we started this was, the fact checker, which started in 2007, around the same time as PolitiFact. We try to very carefully use the statements to write more deeply about policy and explain complex policy issues to readers. And we did not want to be distracted by the latest thing that the president said that you could basically fact check in a couple of sentences or in a tweet yourself.
Right.
So we said, we'll just create this database as an extra thing there to, so we don't get distracted from our core mission. And instead, it's become this all-consuming thing because we have a Pinocchio scale, and we try to list everything that would qualify as 2 Pinocchios or above in the database. And if he gives a speech, it's 50, 60, 70. One speech was 120 claims. So it's really, it's quite a bit.
I'll say it is. We'll talk more about the president as we move forward here. Glenn, thanks so much for joining us today. Our next guest, another longtime journalist, reporter, and editor for such papers as the Bergen Record and the Philadelphia Inquirer, as well as USA Today. And since 2010, he has been director of factcheck.org. He is Eugene Kiely. Eugene, thank you so much for joining us here today. 2010, so I was talking with Angie about this a few moments ago. How has fact-checking, at least for you, evolved over the last 10 years?
Well, factcheck.org started in 2003 with Brooks Jackson, a former CNN, Wall Street Journal, and Associated Press investigative reporter. So of the 3 fact-checking organizations, it goes back the furthest. And when I started in 2010, there would be some times we'd be struggling to come up with some material. Particularly Congress is out, the president isn't saying much. There was no daily tweets, no daily press conferences, well, there were daily press conferences, but there wasn't that much to come out of those. There were some slow times, and we're able to be then writing about some other races like the California governor's race, or something that we wouldn't necessarily do, but would want to keep an eye on.
How important is that now when you look at it, Eugene? I mean, it's so easy to get caught up in what's going inside the Beltway and almost forget about a lot of the things that are going on outside the Beltway. How much of that is it a mission of yours to let's keep our eye on other things, not just what the president's tweeting or what he's saying in his latest press conference?
Yeah, but it is very important to us. We particularly on the midterm elections, we're focusing on key Senate races, key House races. In presidential years, like we're facing now, the Senate could flip. So we have identified 10 races, assigned them to different reporters to track and follow. We have a TV advertising service that provides us with the TV ads for all the House races, all the Senate races, all the presidential races. So yeah, we are trying to do many things here. We have something like which we call Player's Guide, which is profiles of the individual organizations out there, third-party groups that are spending millions of dollars to try to influence elections. Where we are following the Senate races that are important. We've got a lot of balls in the air, and we're trying to keep our eye on all of them.
Well, thank you so much, Eugene, for joining us, and we'll talk to you more in just a bit. Finally, let me bring in Karen Mahabir from the Associated Press, where she is the fact check and misinformation editor, another longtime journalist. She was also the managing editor of the Huffington Post, managing editor of news for the Huffington Post. Karen, fact checker for the Associated Press. I can't imagine a more daunting, important, demanding job in all of journalism. Just what is it? Just explain that to me. Just when you tell people this is what you do, the enormous pressure you must have to have that title.
It is a lot of pressure, but I like to think that I have the best and most exciting job at the AP. I mean, there's no shortage of material to work with, and we have a wonderful team of fact checkers, really all around the world. Who help us, debunk claims online and write great fact checks, of our elected leaders. So it's really work that we've been doing for decades, and I feel like it's really part of our DNA at the AP.
I don't know, and maybe I'm totally wrong. I'm going to say something dumb, and all four of you can jump on me. We all started off as journalists and working. It's sort of I guess, quote unquote, traditional type of journalism where reporters would go out and do stories. I don't know that does anybody come out and say, I want to be a fact checker at some point? Like, how did you get into it? And is it what you hoped it would be, what you thought it would be?
It's an interesting question. I mean, my background was as a newspaper reporter and columnist, and as a reporter and editor and producer for the AP. And I really covered a variety of topics, immigration and government and courts and breaking news. But I really started getting interested in this space after 2016, where I thought, this is a space I know is going to grow. It's going to become more important. And as we started to untangle what had happened in 2016, I started to see just how important this work was. And so when the job opened, I pretty much jumped at it. And it's been quite a wild ride ever since, I will say.
Like how so? Like I know it's we can imagine what wild ride means, but I mean, give us a sense of what your daily work life is like.
Well, it's heavy workload for sure. We're looking across the spectrum. We're looking at really all layers of misinformation. So we're looking at misinformation that's coming from our elected leaders and public figures, and not just, out of Washington, but really around the globe. And then we're looking at all the claims that are bubbling up from the bottom. And we're seeing how those things really connect. And now, I mean, I started 2020 thinking we're really going to focus on the election. Of course, moved by coronavirus, and then moved by reopen protests, and then into the current protests we have. And so It's been, it's been a challenge, really, I think, to kind of keep tabs on all these different spaces. But we've really kind of divided it up among the team and really just like prioritize those claims. But this job is nothing what I thought it would be. I mean, it really has changed so much in the last 3 years in the time that I've been doing it. It's incredible.
Well, I imagine it's changed, well, not only in the last 3 years, but in the last 3 months. And thank you again, Karen, for joining us. And let's open up for more of a roundtable discussion. I want to talk about the story that really has dominated the news for the past several months. We'll get into George Floyd and the protests in just a bit, but the big story, of course, that is overtaking the world is the coronavirus. Angie, let me start with you to kick things off. I think there are a lot of things that I think the most certain thing we can say about coronavirus is that we're uncertain about coronavirus. I mean, we're talking about, I realize things have been politicized, but for the last 3 or 4 months, we've had conflicting reports on how this virus is spread. We've had to deal with new terms like curve and flattening the curve. We've talked about numbers and do we believe the numbers, or where are the numbers coming from, and treatment and vaccines and timelines and all this. So as a fact checker, how do you even begin to fact check something that even many of our so-called experts can't agree on what's fact and what's real?
We saw a lot of misinformation come out immediately about coronavirus, but it fit into some old categories. And I think the top example for us was fake cures. People saying that, oh, if you drink bleach, it'll cure coronavirus. I mean, and people were saying that way before there was this controversy about what President Trump did or didn't say about disinfectants. But we just saw all these fake cures, and those are relatively easy to debunk. Whenever you're fact checking public health, fortunately, there is a scientific community that is right there along with us and helping us and telling us what they know and what they don't know. And a part of it was some of the misinformation was so bad that it wasn't that challenging to fact check. More complicated, I think, is giving our audiences information they need to know and want to know. With some of our enterprise stories, we did do a story called Top 10 Uncertainties about Coronavirus, just to give people the picture of, like, we don't know where the virus is, we don't have enough testing, we don't know how immunity to this works. So all of those things kind of swirl together.
Karen, sort of the same question. Where do you even begin? You wake up in the morning and there are 1,000 different roads you can go down. What sort of became the priority? Is it public health? Is it what are we looking at when you wake up in the morning to look at when it comes to the coronavirus?
I agree so much with what Angie just said. We pretty much approached it the same way. And at the AP, we have the benefit of having a really large and very talented health and science team. So I would often turn to them when I was trying to sort through what we were seeing online and what we could really definitively say, was fact. But we really started every morning looking across the board, looking at the claims and trying to prioritize the ones that we really thought that posed real harm. Just like Angie said, we saw an explosion of home remedy claims, from the fairly innocuous, like eating bananas could, help prevent contracting coronavirus, to the more serious, around disinfectants and bleach and things like that. So we really tried to prioritize what we went after. And a lot of times, we weren't able to really debunk things definitively. And, we thought it was better explained through a story. And so, in fact, what we came up with was a whole new fixture called Viral Questions, where we attempted to answer commonly asked questions around the coronavirus. And, we were really transparent about what we knew, but also more importantly, what we didn't know. And so we would really just point people to credible sources. We'd say, this is what this latest CDC guidance is, and this is what the latest World Health Organization guidance is, and here are what the experts are saying. And just to give people as much information as we could so that they could make informed decisions, in their daily lives.
Eugene, Karen touched on something. Is it ever frustrating that people are expecting you to fact check something and we just don't know what the facts are, particularly when it comes to a life and death story like coronavirus? I mean, are there times where you just have to lay off because you're not really sure what's true and what's not true?
No, we don't lay off on it. And as Karen said, we have to be transparent about what we know and don't know. We're fortunate on our staff, and I'm fortunate to have someone who's got a PhD from Yale in immunology and is our science writer, and she has been for the past couple of years. So when it comes to debunking or writing about some of the more complicated claims, she's the person who handles those. Like, for example, this story that she did very early on, that this was bioengineered in a Chinese lab. And this was this very long Facebook post that included citations of research and all that. I looked at it and, my head just exploded. So she took a look at it and was immediately able to identify all the holes that were in this and wrote a very thorough piece that we are still sending out to readers who ask us about it.
Glenn, the first couple of months of when things were getting really serious about coronavirus, we were getting these daily coronavirus updates from the White House Coronavirus Task Force. We'd see Dr. Fauci up there, we'd see Dr. Birx, and then moments later we'd see President Trump come out and say something that was the complete opposite of what we heard from our medical experts. During that time, and I say during that time because we're not seeing very many of these White House press conferences anymore, and I can't remember the last time we saw Dr. Fauci or Dr. Birx in one of these things. What was your plan of attack when you watched these press conferences and when you were getting two obviously very different messages, one from our medical experts and one from our president?
Well, we've learned from experience not to necessarily trust what the president says. We would look for opportunities to delve deeply in these issues if we could, take a presidential statement as a jumping off point that allowed for a deeper article that helped explain the inconsistencies or the falsehoods he was saying. One thing I'm particularly pleased about our coronavirus coverage is, the Washington Post fact checker has gone very heavily into video. We have a whole video team, and their videos during this period were really extraordinary, explaining, debunking the things that people heard and saw. And we actually get more viewers of our videos than the actual written fact checks. So one video that we did on the origins of the virus in Wuhan, and the question is whether it came from a lab or not, that got more than 2 million views on YouTube. It was just an extraordinary response. Another video we did examining how the United States had screwed up testing when it's supposed to be the premier health, the leader in health around the world. That video got 500, 600,000 views on YouTube. So that combination of the talent of the video team, as well as the deep reporting we could bring to it with the authority of the fact checker, I think we were able to serve our viewers and our readers really well in a great combination.
Angie, was there for lack of a better word, was there an appetite for a certain type of story that readers of PolitiFact wanted you to cover when it came to coronavirus?
I think people just wanted to know anything and everything about it. I mean, we have, in the US, we've heard for years about the threats of pandemic, and we maybe there was a little bit in 2014. We fact checked a lot about Ebola, but Ebola never really showed up in the United States in any kind of significant way. So this was the first time we had to deal with a pandemic after years of warnings about it, and the appetite for information about it was just pretty much bottomless for the first month. I also wanted to say PolitiFact's part of the Facebook third-party fact checkers, and Facebook has really been a game changer for us in getting ahead of misinformation and seeing claims that are just bubbling up. For those of you who either work in the program yourselves, you fact checkers who are part of the third-party program, this queue that surfaces misinformation that Facebook users flag is extremely useful to us as far as fact checking. So that's been really helpful. And people want to know if the things that they see on social media are true or not. And unfortunately, it seems like lately a lot has not.
Eugene, sort of touching on that same topic, a lot of times, as Angie just mentioned, we see misinformation coming from the bottom up. But in this case, we're seeing misinformation coming from the top down. When I say the top, I'm talking about the president and some of our government leaders. So sort of which way do you aim your eyes when it comes to information that's, like I said, we're used to it coming from the misinformation from the bottom up as opposed to the top down?
Right. Well, at factcheck.org, we have really three different kind of components of what we do. We have those who are fact-checking politicians' claims, which is our original core mission. We added, along with PolitiFact, we are part of the Facebook third-party project. And so we have three people who are dedicated to that project. And then we have a science writer, Jessica McDonald, as I mentioned before. So when this happened, we really became just one unit that was fact-checking from top down and of all the misinformation that was coming from everywhere. So like, for example, the pandemic video that came out, everyone on the staff was involved. And there's 9 people who were going through claims, writing claims, and posting something as quickly as we could. At the same time, we had Jessica McDonald, a science writer, writing about hydroxychloroquine and the claims that are being made by the President of the United States. So everything got turned upside down, and everybody was involved, and this was a hands-on, all hands-on deck situation.
Is there, Eugene, to touch on that a little bit more, was there one story in particular? Was it hydroxychloroquine? We've talked about masks. That's become a real touchstone right now. Social distancing. For a while there, ventilators seemed to be the main focus. Was there one aspect that was particularly difficult or challenging to sort of wrap your arms around?
Thankfully, no, because Jessie, our science writer, was able to handle some of this. But honestly, without her, I really don't know what we would have been able to do, because there are a lot of hydroxychloroquine, for example. I mean, this is something that there's so little known about it, and what wasn't known about it really couldn't be applied to COVID-19. So there was all these different clinical trials that are being held going on, and we're learning more and more and more. And everything we keep hearing about it, we now, FDA has come to the conclusion where this isn't working. We can allow it in hospital settings, so we have learned so much more just in the last 6 to 8 weeks.
Karen, I think one of the things that I think, just as most Americans and most people in the world, they just want to know, okay, when am I going to be safe? When are things going to be normal? When can I go back to my life? When are we going to be, everything going to be fine, basically? And when you're talking about coronavirus, it's not an easy topic, because what we're dealing with let's just take the United States, for example. It's such a vast country. Everything is different. So what's going on in New York may be totally different than what's going on in Kansas or the Dakotas, or even in New York State itself. What's going on in New York City is different than what's going on maybe in upstate. I live in a state, Florida, that is really spread out, really diverse. What's going on in Miami is different than what's going on where I am in St. Petersburg, which was way different than what's going on in some of the rural areas or the Panhandle. So with an audience that's basically spread out across the country, how do you service them when everybody you're talking to is essentially in a different situation?
On 2 levels, really. I mean, I think that, one thing that we have at the AP is that we have a presence in all 50 and all the states. So we are doing stories that are localized for these communities and on a micro level. And then we're also doing the national takeout. So we're really hitting it at both levels. I will say that it has been interesting. We sort of created an email address for people to send in their ideas around what we should be doing. And all of the questions that you just mentioned are all of the questions we get repeatedly. And those are the ones that we really try to answer in whatever vehicle works best, whether it's a story that's directed at a certain community, or whether it's, based on a topic or an issue that we think we can wrap our arms around. So we're really looking at it on 2 levels.
Glenn, sort of the same question. I mean, you're with the Washington Post. So are you concentrating on more what's going on in the Washington, D.C. area? And again, we're talking about a virus that is affecting people in different ways.
Right. Well, for the fact checker, we tend to take a national approach, not necessarily a local approach. We happen to work hand in glove with an extremely large political team and a massive health team. I mean, with some of the top people in all those areas who we can rely on if we have questions. But it's very, very much, we focus very much on the national level with the Post.
Let's move on to the other major story that's been going on at least in the United States over the past several weeks, and that is the death of George Floyd, a black man who died while in police custody in Minneapolis. That has led to protests all across the country and across the world. Angie, this particular story, again, it's turned into somewhat of a political story for many. Can you just talk about the last couple of weeks, the challenges and sort of what areas you've been concentrating on when fact-checking, particularly the protests part of this story?
Yeah, I think when the George Floyd story broke, the primary piece of information was the video of his death, which it was just so gripping, and I think that's what got the public attention. And I think that was more of a traditional news situation where the reporters who were in Minneapolis at the time and the video came together to tell the story. Now, with a lot of major news events, what we see is the event itself, and then the misinformation starts in the form of commentary. So that's when we started really kicking into action. Was the protests start, there's misinformation being put out about really about the protesters themselves. If I had to pick one storyline that we fact check the most, it would be claims that the protests were either planned or paid for, typically by George Soros, who has been coming up in our fact checks for years. And so we had and then it turns into a kind of a traditional fact-checking scenario where we're finding stuff in Facebook, our readers are sending us stuff, we're listening to what the politicians are saying, and we're just kind of putting the fact checks out as they come. But I think there's another conversation that's been in journalism that's been very important, and that's like looking at ourselves. I don't think American journalism as a whole has done enough to have diversity in our newsrooms, and certainly PolitiFact still has work we can do to make sure that our staff is diverse and that our fact checks account for different, all the different points of view out there. So the protests have raised all of those issues.
Karen, you want to piggyback on that thought from Angie a little bit?
I would agree. I mean, diversity is definitely very important for the AP, and I think we do have a very diverse newsroom. I would just echo just how important it is. But one of the, and just again with the protests, it's exactly as Andrew said. As soon as it started happening, we saw an explosion of misinformation around the protest movement. One of the things, one of the storylines that we tried to focus on was outsiders coming into these protests. We kept seeing claims around outsiders traveling to these protests. And so what we did as a form of accountability journalism is that we looked at the arrest records from two protests, one in Minneapolis and one in DC, and we really looked at the court records, we looked at the social media presence, we looked at who these people were, and we could see no evidence. I mean, they were all seemingly local to the area of the protests, and didn't seem affiliated with groups on either the right or the left. And and we really tried to get at that in a lot of different kinds of stories, but I felt like that one piece really sort of showed, here's some evidence to say that there are not outsiders coming into these protests. So that was one just line of reporting that we really looked at carefully.
Yeah, can you expand on that a little bit, because it seems like this is just covering these protests. They're so chaotic. There's so much going on. You're doing in many cases with thousands of people. Can you just give us a little bit of the X's and O's of just how you put together a story and how you can determine these people are not coming in from the outside, or these are not paid protesters or whatever. How do you even do a story like that?
It's certainly a challenge. I mean, it is a challenge because, you can't be at all these protests at the same time. You can't be doing all of them. But when you have claims around, Antifa activists coming in, or people traveling to other states to take part in protests, or these protests being planned, if you can focus in, and that's what we did with this story, was like we really honed in on 2 protests that got a lot of attention. And we spent days, hours going through every single person who was arrested to get to that. And I think that was, that is how you get to showing whether there's evidence for this or not.
Angie, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed the fact checks that looked at where the protesters who had been arrested were from. I think a lot of those stories really debunked this idea that cities were seeing paid protesters bust in from out of state. And this is a situation where, like, PolitiFact is working in partnership, not formally, but in partnership with local journalists, because we would see this piece of information on Facebook and we would fact check it by saying, the Minneapolis newspaper has looked into this and linking to their report and saying this is not true. And I think this is where the fact checking framework can work with traditional journalism in a very powerful way, where we get these claims from online and we can kind of connect them with journalists who are on the ground and really do debunking work. Because I think all of us would say our fact checks rely on the work of other journalists often, who are eyewitnesses to whatever's going on. And because we share an ethical framework, we find them very trustworthy.
Glenn, I want to touch on a story that you wrote about just recently, something that happened in Buffalo, where you had a 75-year-old man who was knocked over by Buffalo police, fell down, was injured. And then the president tweets out a story from OAN Network. And for those who are not familiar, OAN is, I think you best described as sort of a alt-right cable news network that often floats baseless conspiracy theories. And this gets to a bigger question I'd like all of you to touch on, if you could, about fact checking. And that is, I realize the president of the United States tweeted out this story, but there's also the other side, that this is a little known cable network putting out a obviously just completely outrageous story. So where is sort of the balance, Glenn, when you're looking at this of, we need to debunk this, and at the same time we're giving it a little bit of air. We're actually telling people about something that's clearly a lie in order to debunk it. So I guess, is there a risk in repeating a lie in order to debunk it?
Well, it's a constant issue, and we do have standards for things that might appear on YouTube or in social media. If this hasn't been shared a lot, we're not going to bother fact checking it. But if it's the president of the United States spreading a conspiracy theory, that's something you can't really ignore. And in this case, it was just interesting to unspool how, where this developed from, and what the back, kind of going back into the netherworlds of the internet to see how it actually emerged into this report by One American News Network, and then in the president's Twitter feed. So that made it also an interesting story to write about. If I could just comment on two things that we were talking about before.
Sure.
One is in terms of the impact of the George Floyd situation on the news business. The Washington Post actually announced last week that it was going to hire 12 additional people to cover issues related to race and racism, and that was in response to, in part, in response to a petition that 500 Washington Post journalists signed, asking for more people to cover this and more attention in terms of hiring people of color. So that was a pretty significant response very quickly, which you don't often see in big news organizations. Usually they're like, super tankers that take a long time to turn around. And the other thing, which it was not really something that the fact checker was part of. However, elements of the fact checker video team were part of this, because one of the things we've tried to develop on our video team is video verification. So they produced 2 really excellent videos. One that took all these different camera angles and scenes from George Floyd and the beating by the police. I mean, and it really was stitched it together. I think it was one of the most viewed videos on the Washington Post website. And then as a further feat, in both cases, the video people were working with the investigative team, was an amazing video about what happened in the Lafayette Square when the president walked over there to hold up the Bible in front of the church. And that again involved going through all sorts of videos that were, people taken with their cell phones and different camera angles and, timing everything precisely. And I just, we didn't have much to do with it except, fact checker video people were enlisted to be part of that investigation. I just, if you people haven't watched that video, you should watch it because it is just an extraordinary piece of work, and it demonstrates how you can use this new medium to show things in a way that you can't necessarily do with the written word.
No, and I think that's a great point. We also saw the New York Times recently with the video work that they did with the man who was killed in Atlanta outside the Wendy's. So I applaud all that work being done. Eugene, let me go back to the question that I asked Glenn, and it's a question I'm sure that you get frequently. Sort of, where is that line between let's debunk a theory, but not publicize the lie that it came from? Where is that line for you?
Well, it's a very good question. It's something that factcheck.org has been worried about for a long time, long before I even had gotten here. Like Glenn had said, when you don't want to give oxygen to something that hasn't gotten a lot of play on social media. So, when we're looking at a YouTube video that hasn't gotten much traction, it really isn't worth our time to do that because we have such a large presence on Facebook ourselves. If we're writing about it, then we're exposing it. But if it's something the president has written about, something like the pandemic video that has gotten so many views, when we're working with the Facebook project, we are able to, because of the information they provide us, be able to identify stuff that has gone viral already or is receiving a lot of traction within the last 24 hours. So we're able to, as Angie is saying, it's a great tool to be able to identify stuff that is just starting to take off.
Karen, same question. I mean, do you ever struggle with, maybe we shouldn't even write about this because maybe a lot of people don't even know about it and we're giving it oxygen?
It's probably the one question our team spends the most time discussing. It's a very delicate calculus, really. I mean, we're looking at, claims that are going viral for sure. We definitely want to be sure that there is some attention there. But we're also looking at cross-pollination. So, if there's a claim that we're seeing that's really big on YouTube and we're starting to see some chatter on Twitter, we'll start to focus in on that, looking at that overall. We're also looking at claims that, when I look at claims and prioritize the ones I want to do, I want to look at the ones that threaten the integrity of the stories that we're putting out, the main stories that we're putting out, our actual coverage. So if it's dipping into that, I'm gonna prioritize those as well. So, and sometimes, you can come across like a singular claim that seems like it's just a small thing on its own, but when you think about it, it actually fits into a larger narrative around something, a larger conspiracy theory. And so we keep our eyes on those as well to see how are these little points feeding into something bigger. And we may prioritize that as well.
Angie, let's go back to this past weekend. I want to get your thoughts on what we saw in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the president of the United States going out, really his first trip out to a rally and a public appearance like that since the coronavirus outbreak. About 2 hours of the president with an open mic, off script, much of the time, off teleprompter a lot of the time. How do you even begin to fact check something when he's going to say about 400 things that you could probably hone in on if you wanted?
Yeah, it's challenging. For us, we pick our shots. We also have a new story format that we used for this. We call it the Stump Speech Analyzer. And it's because we were doing all these specific fact checks of the candidates' stump speeches, but I felt like we were missing, what was their big message? What was the big picture? So now when we cover these speeches, and we don't do it for every speech, but when a speech is newsworthy enough, and this one certainly was, we give people an idea of what the main narrative was. And in this case, if you go and read our story, it was extremely divisive, and frankly racist. There were many negative stereotypes of Hispanics. He went after Ilhan Omar again, a congresswoman from Minnesota. I mean, it was a very, it was not, you would think that after the coronavirus and all these protests that, you know, a regular politician would come forward with some sort of spirit of reconciliation, but there was none of that here. So it was extremely divisive. And then he has these talking points that he's used 100 times that are wrong, like where he says, "Oh, we passed the biggest tax cut in history." That's false. It was not the biggest tax cut in history. So
Greatest economy.
yeah. I mean, you know, I would love to hear like how we deal with President Trump is, I mean, I think we all do it the same way, which is just keep fact checking him. I don't think it is affecting his own, like, I don't think it's making him, I don't think it's influencing him in any way that I can see. Like he doesn't seem to care if he's corrected or not, or his team doesn't seem to care. I'd be interested if anyone on the panel disagreed with me there. But we're doing this to, as Neil Brown said, even up the balance of power. So at least the public knows what's being said isn't true.
Eugene, I mean, does he care? Does his people care? Do his supporters care?
In terms of why the administration cares, it depends on who's in that position at the time. I mean, we've cycled through a lot of contacts with the administration in the press office. Very early on, there was someone by the name of Stephen Chung, who was very responsive, sometimes combative, but in a good manner. You know, you want to have give and take with the administration, with any administration. Certainly, we had that with the Obama administration. But then there'd be periods of times there'd be radio silence. You wouldn't hear anything from anyone, and it seemed like they didn't care. So it comes and goes. It just ebbs and flows. Right now, there's good communication that we have with the campaign, and I believe Angie and the others could attest to that too. So I think some people care some of the time is what it comes down to.
I should say the campaign has been. I just want to say I do want to get the campaign has been responsive to us, and there's been an improvement during that time. So Eugene, thank you for helping me be fair.
Yes, I completely agree about the campaign, particularly compared to 4 years ago, where that right. Campaign, you know, it was kind of a shoestring campaign and didn't really have like a rapid response team or anything like that. So the only person was Stephen, who most of the time was not particularly responsive during the campaign, but then he was when he got to the White House, as well as some other people. But though I think lately I find with the new communications team at the White House that's just been installed in the last few weeks, things have gotten better, and we consistently get responses to our questions. So, you know, like Eugene was saying, it ebbs and flows.
Karen, what do you hear from readers, and what do you hear from your audience? I'm sure that if Angie were to fact check, I know I work with people at PolitiFact. I'm sure when they fact check President Trump and he gets a pants on fire, Glenn gives him 4 Pinocchios, they're not getting phone calls saying, "Hey, great job, thanks for keeping the president in check." And look, we could probably say the same thing that you probably hear from Democrats who complain whenever you say something about Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer, whomever. I mean, it seems like this is like facts are facts. What's true is true. And yet I'm sure you get reaction from your audience that says you're biased against the president. How do you deal with that?
We absolutely do. And I mean, I think that these are extremely partisan times. We get a lot of pushback of, you know, I mean, some of them are complimentary, but some of them are, hey, leave my guy alone. Stop fact checking Trump. And, are you fact checking both sides of the aisle? And yes, we are. But my typical response is, we are fact checking the person who sits in the Oval Office, the person who carries weights, the person whose words matter. And it isn't about a political party. It's about your power. It's about, how much effect you can have on people.
I would say that
Glenn,
I would just,
oh, yeah, go ahead.
no,
Please.
The biggest issue we face often is that people disagree with the final rating. So at the Washington Post, like at PolitiFact, we have 4 Pinocchios versus, Pants on Fire. And often it's like, oh, how can that be 4 Pinocchios? That's really only 1 Pinocchio or whatever. For a while there, we let readers vote, and it was always split. It was either a Geppetto checkmark or 4 Pinocchios. That's how the voters, depending on whose ox was being gored.
Eugene, did you want to add something as well?
Yeah, I would like to say, I think that the pushback that we get, from what I've been seeing over the past 10 years, is pushback from people, from partisans who are very strongly supportive of their candidate. So, we see it with Donald Trump for sure, but we have seen it twice with Bernie Sanders supporters for sure. So,
Oh, wow.
it isn't just a political, it isn't a party partisan thing. It is when people care about their candidates and they feel that you're not giving them a fair shake.
Angie?
Yeah, a couple of things. I do think that nobody likes when you're cracking on their team, and that's still true. Now, having said that, Trump says so many false things that we have to devote a great amount of time fact checking him. And what's being lost is, I think, quite a bit. Eugene mentioned earlier, and I would agree with this, like we used to fact check a lot more down ballot races with that,
Right.
and spend more time on other campaigns. PolitiFact is going to be ramping up its congressional fact checking later this summer. But like I was looking at some of the primary contests that are going on tomorrow, that in years past we would have fact checked because we'd had time to do it, and now those kinds of lower profile local races are not getting attention. And then secondly, we used to do a lot of fact checks that were really kind of like public policy explainers.
Oh, we lost you there for a second, Angie. Glenn, I wanted to touch on something that Angie sort of alluded to a minute. It's a little bit off the fact-checking path, but watching what happened Saturday night in Tulsa, we were expecting, apparently there were 1 million ticket requests. We were at least expecting more than 19,000 people because there was an overflow crowd that was supposed to be set up. That never appeared. We had about 7,000 people or so. There could be a lot of reasons why there were only 7,000 people. Maybe people were worried about running into protesters. Maybe they just didn't want to deal with a big crowd in downtown Tulsa. It could very well be, and my personal opinion, and again, it's just my opinion, I think people are still freaked out by coronavirus and getting indoors with 7,000 or 8,000 other people. Whatever happened, is this what this summer and fall are going to look like when it comes to these campaigns? To Donald Trump, Joe Biden, are we going to see small crowds? What are we looking for? What are these campaigns going to look like this summer?
Right. It's not going to be a traditional campaign. It's going to be very different from the kind of presidential campaigns that we've experienced over the last few decades. And, the problem that the Trump people faced was they set expectations. Right? I never really believed the 1 million tickets. I mean, it seemed ridiculous. You weren't going to have 1 million people there. But, if the problem is hey, Angie's back. The problem is, we often, a politician, you try to downgrade the expectations so then you can exceed them. And Trump set these expectations. He even said on the 15th, he was going to have at least 60,000 people there. He would have seats, 22,000 in the arena and another 40,000 outside. So when you fail to meet those expectations, you're going to get really critical news coverage. I mean, 6 or 7,000 people, that would be huge for Joe Biden. But he doesn't try to attract those crowds anyway, and he's probably perfectly happy to not have to worry about building up those kinds of crowds for the rest of the campaign, because that's not the kind of campaign he's running. The crowds are important to Trump, and I think he's going to feel handicapped not having that adoring audience. And I think this is a sign that he can't necessarily count on that for the rest of the election season.
Eugene, what are the conventions going to look like? What are the debates, if there are any, going to look like?
Well, that's a good question. One thing I know they're not going to look like is we're not going to be there at the conventions, which is, we were there in 2012, we were there in 2016. Disappointed that we're not going to be able to go, but given the risk, it's just not worth it. So who knows what the convention is going to look like? I don't see that they're going to be able to pull off anything that looks remotely anything like past conventions that we've been to. So, and who knows about the debates? I mean, I suspect that if Trump is behind, that he's going to want to hold these debates, and he's frankly very effective at these, despite making a lot of work for us fact checkers. And Joe Biden, by the way, is pretty good for fact checking too. So either way,
we win no matter
we're set up.
We win no matter who wins the election. Let's put it that way.
Karen, talking about these the issues as we go down the stretch here, as we lead up to November. I mean, we've talked about some of the main issues here today: coronavirus, protest, race, and then the economy. Is that all we're going to focus on between now and November, or will we talk about things like climate? Will we talk about things like immigration? And the fact that you guys won't be at some of these conventions or debates, will that impact what we talk about?
I think you hit on the three big ones. Those are the three I would have said as well. And I think what's going to become an issue, I mean, if Trump's tweet this morning is any indication, are questions and claims around voter fraud and mail-in voting. I think it's going to emerge as a key issue. Voting itself, I think, will be an issue. But I think those are the main ones. And I think race is part of every election.
Angie, I mean, what are we just going to think about these three topics, or will we get into things like Karen just said, mail-in balloting? And the other question I have, Angie, will we know the night of the election who won? Oh no!
We can't hear you.
She's thought we can't hear you, Edge. Eugene, will we know the night of the election who won the election?
Yeah.
I have no idea. That's beyond us fact checking.
Yeah, I know. Who wants to be on the record and make a prediction like that?
Well, let me ask you this: between now and election night, what you could be? We'll go around to all of you, and hopefully we can get Angie's mic back here in a second. But between now and election night, you can be as specific as you want or as general as you want. What will be the one topic that we fact check the most between now and November? Karen, I'll start with you. Is there anything, like I said, specific or general as you want to be?
That's a very good question. It's so hard to say because every day is a surprise. I think there's going to be a lot more around coronavirus. I think there's going to be a lot around racial issues. And I guess I would say those two would be the
Eugene?
biggest.
Yeah, coronavirus, both of those are certainly at how Trump has handled the coronavirus. And I think we're going to be writing about, to I think Karen's point earlier, mail-in balloting. There are going to be a lot of issues around voter fraud. There were issues about it even after the election last time, and he won. So I suspect we're going to be hearing a lot of that and writing about
Glenn, any particular topic that we're going to look at more than any other between now and November?
I think we're going to be litigating for the rest of the election season how the Trump administration responded to the coronavirus pandemic. And that's going to be a big part of what the Biden campaign does to attack the president and how the president is trying to defend his record. And so that will be, just a compelling moment.
Angie, I think I have audio.
Yeah, we have it. We can hear you now.
Yeah.
If you want to go back to the last question, go ahead.
I will. First off, on will we have results election night? We just recently published an excellent story by Lou Jacobson that says probably not. With mail-in balloting, there are just going to be too many envelopes to open and unstuff. It's a great story. So anyone who's interested, go to our site and look for it. And then the other issue, I think the issues you mentioned, coronavirus, racial issues in the economy, will be big issues. I don't think climate or immigration will get ignored. I think those are still big issues. And then the one I would add is healthcare. The Democrats had a lot of success in 2018 running very directly on people's personal experiences of healthcare. And I think that's still going to be an issue this year.
Well, I cannot thank you guys enough for taking time. I know you're super busy, particularly during this time of year, and to take time out of your schedule to give us some really, really great insight about what you do and how our country is going to be impacted over the next 5 or 6 months. I can't thank you enough. So Angie and Eugene and Karen and Glenn, thank you so much for joining us today. Audience, thank you for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy Global Facts 7. Thanks for watching.